The Constitution was adopted in 1901 in an era of explicit racism, as opposed to our now casual racism. And the arrangement was made between the new states and the Commonwealth that the Aboriginal people would be the responsibility or the domain of the states. And that left us with some rather strange exclusionary sections in the Constitution that we find pretty unpalatable today. Two key amendments took place in 1967 to allow the Federal Parliament to make laws about Aboriginal people and to delete a section that excluded Aboriginal people from being counted in the population statistics. So we moved from a negative recognition or non-recognition to a kind of neutral form of recognition in the Constitution. But I think now the debate is on whether we're moving to a positive form of recognition of Indigenous Australia. And I think most people are generally surprised when we talk about it that our Constitution fails to safeguard basic human rights that we assume are protected and enforceable in Australia or under the rule of law or in Constitution. And particularly these legal omissions and neglect have worked to exclude Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from not only the history of the Constitution, but actually the real terms and real effect of the Constitution. So I think the Prime Minister probably had some version of this in mind when she convened an expert panel to report on the options for constitutional reform and approaches to a referendum that would be likely or possible to obtain widespread community support. And that panel engaged in a wide community consultation process and received over 3,500 community and civil society group submissions and produced a report with a number of suggestions which we might get to the detail of as we go. But by the end of 2012, the government and some others recognised or felt that there wasn't sufficient momentum or understanding perhaps to garner the sufficient support for a referendum that's required to get a change, and at least to do that in time for the next election in the cycle, which as we now know is coming up relatively soon. So it introduced into Parliament a new bill which has become an act known as the Act of Recognition, and that is to recognise Indigenous Australia's place in the Constitution without actually changing the Constitution yet, and also sets the basis for building some degree of popular support for change. We've also had a joint parliamentary committee to examine that Act, and that has also had a number of submissions from the public. So it's now, after all of this quite elaborate activity that's taking place, over to us to discuss whether it's now time to grasp the historic opportunity and remedy the constitutional deficit and close the recognition gap, or do we adopt a default position of no change? And if we are to change our Constitution, is it to be a significant substantive change and offer a significant improvement for Indigenous Australia, or is it something less than that? So it's over to Kerry, Arabena, George Williams and Chris Graham to discuss the topic of constitutional recognition of Australia's First People, sell-out or stepping stone. So I'll turn to you, Kerry, first.
Thank you very much for that, for a very good overview of the process thus far. And welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming along on what is quite a dreary Melbourne evening to participate in these kind of discussions. And these dialogues are so important, and this is one of many that has been happening around the country this week. I too would like to acknowledge the Kulin peoples, the Kulin nations I should say, and feel Bunjil very close during this week. It has been quite an extraordinary time for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, where we get a chance really to stand up and tell Australia who we are and what we're proud of and what our aspirations are and who we're going to be in the future. And absolutely the fact that who we are going to be is built on the shoulders of giants, many of whom have come before us and led in the civil rights movements around Australia and have made their voices heard. And so in terms of those kinds of things, I believe that it isn't a sellout. I think it is a stepping stone. And the reason that I say that is because what these kinds of opportunities in a nation's improbable progress like we're experiencing at the moment, it gives us a chance to really think about what the rights of peoples are and what those responsibilities are and how we uphold democracy. And we can and must respond to what is really a democratic invocation about the kind of country that we want to live in, and we have an opportunity now to make a decision that executes justice. We really do, and we have to execute those decisions with meaning and with verve and with courage on behalf of justice, not just on behalf of Indigenous peoples. And I say that because I'm very firm in the belief that we are all born equal but different. And I think that that sort of thing's really important to think about, that we can and should have the right to be a diverse peoples in the Australian nation, that we can bring to bear the 300 or so nations that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples hold. And the values of those things need to be valuable to us. We need to be able to say that, but every person in this country has the right to be able to talk about what their values are. I think that what happens is that when the populace is moved to do great things, and in this case we're talking about changing the course of history here in this country, by doing so holding true to a set of principles of democracy and recognise equality and diversity, then we can't help but do something great. And I believe that changing the Constitution is a grand challenge for all of us. It's also grand because what we can do is finally recognise that Australia is made up of old and new Australians. And part of my thinking around this, I'm not a lawyer, I'm basically a mother and a grandmother who, had an improbable journey to this point in my life now, and I would like to think that my kids and grandkids had the opportunity for a great future here. But what I'm hoping is that if we were going to a vote within the next 18 months, that we would vote yes, but I actually have a growing disquiet that we wouldn't all vote yes together. And I think that if we didn't vote yes, if we didn't consider this to be a stepping stone to something about who we are as a nation, then what it will do is cause an enormous amount of confusion in the minds of a lot of Australians about what our national values are and who we're going to, if we're really going to be serious about getting rid of racial discrimination, and if we're really serious about creating a level playing field. And so for that reason, I wouldn't go to a referendum if the result wasn't absolutely guaranteed that we were going to be successful. And that's what I would probably promote from the highest tree in the world, I don't know. But in terms of that, I think it absolutely has to be successful. We have to be able to get a yes. Because there is part of me that believes that the campaign is going to be central to this, not necessarily the sections that need to be changed. And the campaign has to be something that we can look at each other and find something precious in each and every one of us. And so it is absolutely about a campaign of preciousness and engaging in genuine dialogues around what it is that we want to see achieved in this country. And I think that we have a proper place in this nation, one in which we are inestimably precious to each and every Australian, because we hold within our nationhood the oldest culture in the world. The oldest culture in the world. And this great continent that we have the great privilege of calling Australia has held human life within it for 60,000 years, and hopefully for another 60,000 years. So the campaign is going to be something that will not only will sit side by side along with what constitutional reform has to occur, because what we need to think about, I believe, is who we're going to be as nations of nations living in Australia in the next 50 and 100 years. Who are we going to be? What kinds of things will we hold true? What kind of aspirations do we have? And in the absence of some of those things, I don't believe we've got a great Australian story yet that we can all call and hold dear as our own. And I don't think we've yet known how to create a win-win situation for all people. And until we do, then I think constitutional reform in and of itself is not enough. We need to marry that with a campaign of preciousness and also a great narrative about who we are and where we're going.
Thank you, Kerry. Chris? Is there any real value to constitutional change?
Well, I'm the sellout part of the panel. I oppose constitutional reform at the moment, certainly at this juncture. Before I start, I would acknowledge the elders, past and present, and the mighty Kulin Nation, of course. I've got so many reasons for opposing this that I actually wrote a list, and I can't go through the whole list, but I can sum up my opposition to constitutional reform at the moment by saying that I don't want to be part of something that amends a racist constitution to make it a dishonest constitution. And I think there's a genuine likelihood that that's what will happen with the political climate that we have in Australia. I think if you look at what the major parties are talking about, the kind of constitutional reform they're saying early on that they will embrace, they're really only interested in a preamble. Maybe they would amend the race powers in the Constitution, but I suspect not. I think the best that you can hope for in this process is a fluffy preamble at the start of our Constitution that at best would acknowledge prior ownership of land by Aboriginal people. And that is a fundamentally dishonest proposition. If you look at countries like Japan and South Africa, after the Second World War, Japan amended their constitution, and after the fall of apartheid, South Africa amended their constitutions. And the preambles of those constitutions fess up to their past, essentially. They have a very frank look at themselves. I think we're so far as a nation from that place, it warrants not heading down that track at the moment. There's a couple of other reasons. I think it sends the wrong message, not just internationally but domestically. It sends a message that Australia respects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's human rights, and the reality is we don't, and we haven't for a very long time. If you look at the statistics in Australia at the moment, they're inescapable. They're the worst on earth in so many categories. Youth suicides, jailing rates. We have the highest Indigenous jailing rates on earth, and yet we have a parliament who seems to be pretending that some sort of constitutional reform will have some sort of meaning. And I think when you have people living with third world diseases, people living in poverty and the worst life statistics on earth for a very small percentage of the population, I don't think that you could make a case that constitutional reform has any real meaning. The other 2 points I'd briefly make is I'm a white fella obviously, and I don't speak for Aboriginal people, but the Aboriginal people I speak to overwhelmingly don't want this. There are many Aboriginal people I acknowledge who do, but there are many who don't. And it's a difficult number to get your finger on, but one really interesting indicator, I think, is the number of adult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people excuse me, who are enrolled to vote. And at the moment it's less than 50% of the population. Now, I think that speaks volumes about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples think about our system of parliament, which is inextricably linked to our constitution. The final point I'd make is that I think constitutional reform really is, symbolically anyway, and I think this is really George's area of expertise legally, but symbolically I think constitutional reform is heading in the exact opposite direction to what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples want. Fundamentally, the people I speak to want treaty and they want sovereignty, and they want land rights. That's the sense I get as I travel around, and beyond that, they want self-determination. And the only thing that has worked in nations like Australia that have invaded an Indigenous peoples excuse me, and colonised and Indigenous peoples. The only thing that has started to show any difference whatsoever is self-determination. The only nation on earth where the concept of self-determination is controversial is Australia. And we're the nation with the worst statistics on every front, virtually. I think symbolically, constitutional reform is a form of assimilation. That's certainly how it's seen by a great many Aboriginal people I know. So I think it heads in precisely the opposite direction to where we should head.
Thank you, Chris. George, do you think that reform of law and reform of the Constitution can drive social and political and economic change in the way that Chris is concerned about?
Well, it's a big question, and I'd also like to start by acknowledging the First Nations of this place and elders past and present. And I'd also like to say I agree with a lot of what Chris has said. I'm someone who believes we should have a treaty in this country. I wrote a book called Treaty some years ago about how it can be achieved and why it's needed to have a just settlement. I also believe there's many important things that need to be done in this area that this constitutional agenda will do nothing to touch. In fact, I see this as just one piece in a jigsaw puzzle, and it's an important piece, but we shouldn't kid ourselves by pretending that this will deal with a lot of matters that it won't. It won't grant sovereignty, it won't give us a treaty, but I'd still like to say to you that I think this is very important, and it is something that we do need to pursue. And I have to say that we're pursuing this agenda because Aboriginal people have put it on the agenda. It's people over the course of decades, going back to the 1930s, 1940s, leading up to the 1967 referendum, or recently people like Larissa Brent, Noel Pearson, Mick Dodson, Pat Dodson. There's a long list of Aboriginal people who have said, we want the Australian Constitution changed. And personally, I think they've got good reasons for arguing that. I think the starting point is you need to understand why it matters. I mean, why are we caring about this legal document anyway when there are so many fundamental, difficult problems on the ground? And the answer is because the Constitution plays a profound role in shaping the sort of nation we are. In all sorts of ways, it impacts upon life on the ground. In fundamental ways, it shapes who has power in our society. Most importantly, who can do what to whom. And when it comes to Aboriginal people, that question of who can do what to whom is critically important. When we look at the power to take wages away, the power to remove children, the power to have an intervention based upon a racially discriminatory premise, all of those things are traced back to Australia's legal system and ultimately to our Constitution. And I'm someone who's witnessed this firsthand. I've argued in the High Court on behalf of Aboriginal people. I've seen the Constitution be a roadblock to achieving justice for their claims. And I'd have to say to you that if you want to achieve some of these goals, ultimately things like a treaty in the longer term, you've got to tackle this big piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And it just happens at the moment that there's interest in having a debate on this issue. And I'd say when there's interest, have that debate. Let's see if we can win it, have the conversation we need to have, and actually see if we can bring the community alongside. If we can't, then I agree with Kerry. You don't hold the referendum unless we've got a good chance of winning and it's about something substantive and meaningful. But there's a good reason that Aboriginal people in particular have argued for constitutional change, and that's because the Constitution was drafted in a way that has been fundamentally unjust when it comes to the treatment and place of Aboriginal people in our country. The Constitution was drafted on the basis that Aboriginal people were, to quote the words, a dying race. It wouldn't even be right to describe Aboriginal people as second-class citizens in Australia. That's putting it too high. They weren't citizens at all. They couldn't vote. They were denied the vote immediately when we became a nation. All of that goes back to the Constitution. Today, the Constitution doesn't mention Aboriginal people at all. It's as if they just don't exist in this continent, as if we didn't have people here since 1788, as if that concept of terra nullius is embodied in our most fundamental law. But what the Constitution does mention, if it doesn't mention Aboriginal people, is it mentions the idea of race. And race is built into our Constitution in very disturbing ways. Section 25 of our Constitution, it's still there, it's headed races disqualified from voting. And it was put there to enable the states to recognise that they can stop people voting because of the colour of their skin. We've never taken that out of the Constitution. Another clause, section 51(26), is a power that gives the Commonwealth the power to make laws for people because of their race. It was put there so that people could be stopped from living with whites, could be prevented from having jobs that white people might have. It's still in the Constitution, it's never taken out. It was put there, in the words of our first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, to pass laws for the coloured and inferior races in the Commonwealth. Now, Australians are horrified we haven't removed these clauses, but they're still there. And when people today ask me, how is it something like the intervention can happen? How is it that laws can be passed in this day and age that fix upon race? My answer is, we as a nation have never fixed our constitution. We've never moved on from the values of 1901. And I would say that if we care about those things, one of the things we need to do is remove the racist clauses and have a constitution that actually requires people to be treated equally and fairly and provides a level of recognition and a starting point, not an end point, but a starting point for realising Aboriginal justice.
Thank you. Is this the campaign that we should be putting political and social energies into? I know Chris is saying it's probably not the time to put it into.
I think you've just got to be pragmatic and strategic about these things. At the moment, there's a willingness to tackle this issue of changing the Constitution. I haven't given up yet on the possibility that it's meaningful reform. But put it this way, if at the end of this debate we don't get to something that's worthwhile, and in particular if Aboriginal people don't believe the change is worthwhile, and even though I think we need it, I'll be voting no myself. I mean, I'll take my guidance from this from Aboriginal people as to whether they think the level of recognition is substantive and important enough. But we haven't had a conversation of this kind about the Constitution since the 1960s. You know, it's a long time since we last had it. If we don't have it now, frankly, I don't think we should put off fixing these clauses in the Constitution, fixing these problems of race within the Constitution for another 40 or 50 years, because it may take that long to grab the attention of our leaders and to have the chance to push them forward. So if we're talking about a treaty now, I'd say let's go for that. We're not. That we do need to talk about that. Let's use this. Let's see if we can win this debate. And as I've said, actually use it to open a conversation for some bigger and even more important changes.
And in terms of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples that was set up in 2009, it's got over 5,000 individual members and quite a lot of organisational members. That has been one of the policy platform areas that they've actually wanted to progress with. They have themselves gone around the country, they have initiated those discussions, and they have heard overwhelmingly that there is support for constitutional reform. However, there are two really important provisos. One is that you remove all indications of race throughout the body of and racism, doesn't allow any or permit any more acts of racism, and the other is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are fully recognised in the Constitution. And those two things, I think, if they were able to be met, if they are adequate criteria, then the new organisation that is leading our representation at a national level and engaging with parliamentarians on these issues has said that that's what we're up to. It doesn't preclude or dismiss or deny any of the conversations around treaty or sovereignty, but this is on the table at the moment. It does constitute for us a once-in-a-generation or once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It is 45 years since we have had those kind of discussions, and whilst we are a very patient people, I don't believe that anyone deserves in this country to wait another 45 years for us to mature as a nation and take our rightful place in where we go to next.
When are the words going to be shown for people to see what the hell we're talking about?
I can say the answer to the words is, no, we haven't seen the words, and the words matter, because the words can make the difference between a proposal like the one Chris is concerned about that frankly isn't worth much at all, and a proposal that actually means something and would lead us towards a path of justice and meaningful change. And what Tony Abbott has said is that if he wins the election this year, he will release the words he'd like to see within 12 months. Of the election this year.
That's generous, very generous of him.
Well, and I would say that if that's going to happen and it's going to be meaningful, it's got to be released on the basis of the community demanding a set of words. It's got to be a process that actually enables people to have their say. That's why this sort of event is important, and indeed a lot of events happening around the country this week are important. I'd also say that I understand what you're saying in terms of the larger picture, but it's also a matter of us that you have to be somewhat pragmatic about these debates, as Aboriginal people were in 1967. Back then, there were debates about things like removing the clause that said you can't count Aboriginal people in the census. There was also a debate prior to that about whether Aboriginal people should have the vote. And a lot of people, I've read the documents at the time, were saying that you shouldn't argue for Aboriginal people to get the vote. It takes a lot of energy. There's more important issues. But I think when we look back, you'd say, surely that was worth doing, to actually make sure Aboriginal people were given the vote ultimately in 1962. And this is like that. It's one of these issues that matters, and I think that we make a mistake if we don't understand the value of symbolism and also substantive change in this area.
I agree with George. I think the words are crucially important, but I think people are going to be desperately disappointed. And the reason why I think that, I mean, I'm a hopeless optimist trapped in the body of a bitter pessimist.
I'm just an optimist.
That's what journalism and then Aboriginal affairs does to a man. But the race powers, I'm going to start crying like Eddie did on radio.
Yeah,
the Wailing Wall, as he called it. The race powers, and George will correct me if I'm wrong, affect all people of race in Australia. They don't just affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
But they've only ever been used for Aboriginal people.
Three times, and to our enduring national shame. What I think is so interesting is that the focus around the Recognise campaign is around Aboriginal people, but the racist effects of the Constitution affect all people of colour. And that is why I think they're heading for a preamble and nothing else. But there's nothing to stop the Australian Parliament or the Australian people rewriting their Constitution tomorrow and removing powers to be racist. I don't know what sort of a nation needs powers to be racist other than Australia in this era. But there's a great artist in Brisbane, Richard Bell, who won a Telstra Art Award for a painting called Aboriginal Art, It's a White Thing. And I think that fits the constitutional debate very well. The constitutional debate is a white thing. I don't think it excludes Aboriginal people, and I don't think it should. But I think we've got all the work to do, but I don't think that should impact on what First Nations people pursue in their own time, pursue as well as treaty and sovereignty and self-determination. I think they're totally separate issues.
One striking thing about Australia is, as far as I'm aware, we are now the only nation in the world that has a clause in its constitution that actually enables racial discrimination. We're unique.
That's
People
a
are
surprise,
shocked.
George. That's a real surprise.
It's shocking. I mean, the broader community is utterly unaware that that is the case. And I would agree with Chris and think the ultimate goal here should be not only recognising Aboriginal people, but part of that having a clause in the Constitution that says no person should be discriminated against on the basis of their race. And that should apply to governments, to policies, and should be a universal protector for all people. That's going to be hard to achieve. It may not be achieved, but one thing the polling shows is that that's what the community wants.
But that's the extraordinary thing. It's a no-brainer to say that a country should not, the last country on earth to retain some form of racism in their constitution should get rid of it. That's a no-brainer. But I don't think that's the debate we're going to have. I think the debate we're going to have is a fluffy preamble.
I've got a question in the front here.
Yeah, thanks, Max. And you talk about justice. I just wanted to go a bit further on that. And wouldn't you think that true justice for the Aboriginal people would then be not only recognising this in the Constitution, but recognising our sovereign right and our sovereign law within this country? Wouldn't that be true justice?
absolutely. But the kind of changes that we're talking about in the Constitution don't preclude those conversations. They don't stop that level of justice being heard. They don't stop us as a country making the decisions to implement those things. It doesn't take that off the table at all. This is what is on the table at the moment. Yeah, this is what's on the table at the moment. That's why I'm saying it's a stepping stone. I'm not saying once we've got constitutional reform, that's it, we've solved, problem solved, tomorrow it's all going to change. Doesn't mean that we're not going to lock kids up in detention centres or do other things on a basis of race. I would like to think that we were going to mature as a nation and have a human-to-human conversation about what's the greater humanity in all of this. Where do we want to come to the common ground? What is our future going forward? All of those kinds of things, I think, are only going to happen by virtue of the will of the people. Now, at the moment, we're 700,000 people in amongst 24 million. That is a very small number of people to make our voices heard. And so in terms of forums like this, you've got to be that voice for us. And you've got to act with decency and execute justice and know that this is the first step along a much longer road to building the kind of nation that we can all take enormous pride in. So that's why I think your comment before, sir, about the fact that it isn't right for anyone to experience poverty, it isn't right for anyone with a mental health issue to be imprisoned or incarcerated, it isn't right for anyone to work 18 hours a day in a sweatshop and not be paid. All of those things should shame us all at a very human level, because it's not the decent thing to do. It doesn't prescribe to any of the values or principles that we hold true to as this nation. And it's not the end point of what our tragic history and our improbable journey to here has been. And it certainly will not subscribe for me what the future of this country is. And that's why I'm taking a leadership role in this. That is why it's so important for me to make sure that as many conversations, as many people engage in dialogue, I sit down and as many people as I possibly can, and I think I'm up to about 1,300 just this week alone, talking on these kind of issues, because it is important to me that all of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have country that they belong to, that we have an environment that is sustaining all of us and life as we all know it, that we are not going to erase or eradicate any more species that share this life with us, and that we acknowledge and can look at each other with decency and faith in the common humanity that we all are. That's what I think.
Kerry made the point that, that you need white people to be there for First Nations people. I would be if I thought that it would make a difference, if I thought that constitutional reform would deliver something tangible and usable to First Nations people. I'd absolutely jump in balls and all, but I don't believe it will. I actually think what will happen is what happened with the national apology, is that it will be misused by a cynical leader and by a cynical parliament to portray Australia as a nation that respects the rights and interests of First Nations people, which is of course not what we do. And I think that's fundamentally dishonest, and I don't want to be a part of a process that advantages white Australia once again to say to the world, look, we don't treat our blacks so bad. The reality is we do.
I'm just wondering whether this constitutional reform process or this idea is perhaps a distraction from to try and address the actual treaty issues where Aboriginal people want to have their own land and have self-determination. In the same way you just mentioned about apology, do you think there's some truth to that?
Yeah,
that this is a political stunt to deflect?
I think that sums up my view very well. I'd be interested in Kerry's view about this. I'm yet to meet a First Nations person who doesn't want self-determination, who doesn't support sovereignty or treaty. But I do acknowledge that throughout that there's a gamut of First Nations people who have different views about pragmatically how they'll get there. And I think Kerry has a pragmatically different view to a lot of Aboriginal people I know about how to get there. And I should also say I've got enormous respect for a lot of people in the Recognised campaign. I've got no respect for some, but I've got an enormous amount of respect for many, many people engaged in it. And I think that's worth acknowledging, but I just don't think we're going to get anywhere. But I'd be interested to know what Kerry thinks about self-determination and treaty. You're better qualified to comment than I am. You're a black fella.
I am self-determining.
But as a
that's
nation.
it. But as a nation, I think we have had our best gains in health and education and a whole range of other things through being self-determining, by practising autonomy, by being able to join together in a communitarian way and advocate for what it is that we want to be able to do and move forward. And I have seen some brilliant initiatives like the Murdi Paki initiative, like the different authorities where people have got country back and they've been able to develop it in a way which is appropriate and consistent with the views and values of other people. The whole of Torres Straits is now owned, land, sea, waters, and there are a number of different initiatives that are happening in that space, in that country, in a cultural way which supports those kind of ideals that we've held on to since time out of mind. You know, we are getting on with business in a lot of ways, and we're not waiting for anyone to give us permission to do so. Some of us have had to move off country in order to make that happen. Some of us have got non-Indigenous parents or family members who actually help us cross those big cultural divides. There are many of us now who are going into the universities and coming out with highly accomplished professionals. We have got the best governance, I believe, in the whole of Australia. We have got the only representative organisation, being the National Congress, that has gender equity as a principle. It's the only company registered with ASIC that does so. We are moving mountains, people. Don't get me wrong, there are still people who are disadvantaged and living in poverty. That is absolutely to be true. That's true. There is no doubt about that, because poverty is a human rights issue after all. But there are many more people that I know now who are making changes, who are living their lives in the way that they feel like they need to. And yes, there is frustration, but there is also clear, concise thinking and strategy about how to change and transform those experiences. And I don't believe that people who have been victimised are necessarily victims. I don't follow that one through. I know that people and myself have been incredibly frustrated sometimes, that we have been absolutely given the raw end of a very rough stick. But at the end of the day, we're not fragile people. We are the most resilient people in any other continent on this planet. We have had the most horrific story of colonisation, and we have survived it. And now we are doing more than surviving it. We are making contributions to this nation. We have had 8 Australians of the Year, and you don't do that if you are completely disenfranchised. What I get frustrated the most, what frustrates me the most, is constantly being described in the deficit. There is very, very little recognition of the celebration of who we are, what we've achieved, how far we've come, and who we are and what our measure and mark is in the world. And I think that there is much to celebrate, and I will take every chance to do so.
Thank you.
And linking into that, can I broaden the conversation out a bit? A lot of this is about law, and that's my field, but I think we really underestimate the power and impact of a referendum if it does achieve. It goes way beyond the law in terms of its significance. And you only have to look to the 1967 referendum on Aboriginal peoples. 90% of Australians voted yes. It was a cathartic national moment that led to a revolution in policy when it came to Aboriginal affairs. You can trace from that things like the national sacred sites legislation, ultimately through into native title. You can trace it through to all sorts of things occurring, because at that moment it created a new set of expectations about the role of Aboriginal people, their citizenship, their power within the community, and also the role of government in that area. The other thing to keep in mind here is many people through this referendum themselves are going to be empowered. One of the most inspiring things I've been to in the last 2 years was spending a period of time with 90 young Aboriginal people, with them training to be involved in this referendum, to be the leaders, the forefront of the referendum, to argue about why it's needed, to bring to light stories about Aboriginal Australia, to help change perceptions, to help people understand. They're really powerful people who want to play a key role in this, and through this they themselves are going to be thrust onto the national stage in a way that's going to change perceptions about the role and power of Aboriginal people. And look, the other thing I'd say about referendums, and here Chris, for example, has justifiably been sceptical about a preamble, these opening symbolic words in a constitution. They're not going to change anything in the law, and I accept that. But one of the things that really attracts me in this referendum is the notion that my 7-year-old son in primary school might actually study a preamble, opening words that builds in a concept of justice and recognition, and uses that to start a conversation within his school that leads perhaps to the local Aboriginal community giving presentations about culture and helping my son understand these issues. And these symbolic documents start that conversation, as they do in America and elsewhere. And that, again, has nothing to do with the law, but everything about education. And for me, almost the most important thing about this debate is education and understanding, because I think it's often sorely lacking in these areas. But a national conversation, I think, is part, again, of the way of changing that.
I'm just curious on your thoughts about who this change is for. is it for Aboriginal people to try to address the injustice? Is it for white fellas to appease our sense of guilt or whatever? Or is it for all of us?
I'll take option 2. I think my position's probably obvious. It's to assuage white guilt, is my view. And look, I did mean that dismissively, but I don't mean it dismissively. I think it's a great thing that that's what you want. I think that's genuinely wonderful. But I think if you sit down with the Aboriginal people I sit down with and you ask them what can you do to help, they won't tell you to push for constitutional reform. I think they'll ask you to do something else. But I don't take away from what you're trying to do. I think that's admirable.
Just on that point there, I think it is important that these conversations don't just happen between, black and white Australia. For example, there is a very large community of Vietnamese people who live outside of Cabramatta. I don't know what they think about constitutional reform or the removal of a racist clause, or whether they will acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution. Same with a whole range of other culturally diverse communities. I live in Darebin. It is one of the most culturally diverse communities in Victoria. And I don't think what we've done is have a very wide conversation with all of Australian citizens about what this means. And I think we should, because we need a large number of all of Australian citizens to vote yes in a referendum. I don't think we're there yet.
Look, can I say it's a great question. I don't think it's to assuage white guilt. If nothing else, it's because I don't think most white people feel guilty. To be honest about it. So I think if that's... Maybe they should be, but I think if that's the pitch, I don't buy it for that reason. So perhaps if there was a conversation about this, perhaps people will have a bit more understanding and realise why justice is needed, and that's why the conversation has value. But it's clear to me there's only one way this can get up, and that's because this referendum has to be for everyone. When a referendum requires everyone to vote, you've got to get 7 or 8 million Australians as a minimum voting yes, across the political spectrum, across the nation. This can only get up because we as a nation see this as a defining point in talking about who we are, where we want to go, what matters to us, and moving on from that history. And it's got to be for everyone. If it's pitched in any other way, well, it's a really good way of making sure it fails.
The only thing I would say, and this is probably the arsehole comment of the night, I suppose, but Aboriginal affairs is littered with the bodies of people who meant well, and it's paved with good intent. But if you look at our history, the fundamental mistake we've made at every turn is never stop to ask First Nations people what it is that they want. And I think if you do, I'll take a punt and say they'll want something else. I could be wrong, but we'll see.
I hear the concerns about the proposed amendments not being substantive, but given that the racist clauses are abhorrent, what is it that's stopping us from making it substantive, and what can we as individuals do to make sure that the more substantive change happens?
Thank you.
I think look at the radio. Look at Melbourne the last week. That's what's stopping us. We are so far from a mature conversation about this. We can't even accept, as a nation, that we have a problem with racism.
But doesn't this give us a platform to actually call that?
You've got to. But are you going to drag people kicking and screaming to the platform? And when you get them there, what are you going to do with them? I just don't think we're there. I really don't think we're anywhere near having a mature conversation about this. And I remember the polls in the lead up to the national apology. 60-something% of people opposed the apology before it was delivered. After it was delivered, 60-something% of people supported the apology. I don't think the same thing will happen with constitutional reform, because it requires a vote, not a speech in Parliament.
Yeah, and this is where I differ, I suppose, and it's good we've got some difference on this. But in 1967 we thought we were removing some racist clauses. We did, for example, a clause that said you can't count Aboriginal people in the census, and all those decades ago we as a nation felt it was the right thing to do, to remove those clauses, because we wanted equality on those issues. I mean, surely all those years later we can do just as well in terms of saying let's now remove the rest of those clauses. I'd also say about these clauses, these are unashamedly racist. This isn't the marginal stuff where we're going to debate it. A clause that says race is disqualified from voting and you can be stopped from casting a ballot in a state election because of the colour of your skin has no ambiguity attached to it. And frankly, if we're going to have a conversation, let's start with something like this and I've gone on Alan Jones, the shows around the country, talk back, and the one thing I find is even the conservative shock jocks can't get around the fact that stopping a person voting because of their race is wrong. And that's the power of this conversation if we do it right. My fear is we're not going to do it right, but if we are going to do it right, we start with the community, we work it up, and we actually have a conversation based upon recognising our past and the sort of future we want to have, which will be free of these sort of clauses.
George, do you think if we identify the principles that we believe in and that we think are worth valuing, the words will follow on from that? Because I know people get very anxious about lawyers' words and judges and what could happen, but in some ways, if we can identify that the principles that we think are valuable are to be not racist and to be inclusive and to protect equality before the law, will things follow from that? So do we have to drill down into detail instantly, or can we go for the big picture?
I wish it was as easy as that. I mean, ultimately we have to get to the detail because there are too many examples of people being sold out where they've got some good intentions and in the end it's been drafted in a way that doesn't bear those out. But look, the starting point has got to be not people like myself saying this section of the Constitution. The starting point has got to be, well, what should be the right thing here? What should the Constitution say? Ultimately, in my view, it should be about equality. It should be about recognising Aboriginal people in the way that they want to be themselves recognised, and they should be responsible for telling us the form of words and the level of recognition. And, that's the starting point for me. And then the lawyers should be involved in the sense of making sure it's safe, sound, sensible, but within the remit they've been given. But that's the ideal way. It rarely, if ever, works out that way. It's messy, complicated and political. And that's why ultimately campaigning and community activism is what will make this work if anything does.
Australia is a democratic liberal country. Why should we as Aboriginal people seek to engage with that and not be recognised as sovereign people and be at the whim and mercy of non-Indigenous Australians in that sort of numbers game? How do you reconcile that?
It's just staggering when you're less than 2% of the population. How can we, and we've got a racist constitution, how can we make our will be known? Except through voting. And when I was out living at Wallangaroo, which is about 600 kilometres west of Alice Springs, very young, Keating, who we all loved, went out. Another government came in. The first thing that they did was take away the funding for the mobile polling booths that went out there. And so all of a sudden, the resources that allowed people to participate in voting were taken away. So it's not even that we've got 700,000 people. We do, but under half of them are under the age of 15. They're not even eligible to vote yet. So I take the view that I have to vote so responsibly because in the next 20 years, we're going to have coming into adulthood the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the largest population that we've ever seen of adolescents in our communities ever, and they're going to come in to take up the reins of leadership in a country, but they will come in and take up the reins of that leadership in the largest group ever in the history of our species of adolescents across the entire world. And then when you start positioning our children, who are all under the age of 15, across the largest number of adolescents ever on the planet who are coming into adulthood at the same time, we have to be very careful about the legacy that we leave them. And so I only ever operate from a point of legacy. And I do have to think about planetary concerns in amongst all of this because that's just the way I think about things. Torres Strait Islander, you're meant to. But this is just, I can appreciate that these kinds of things are absolutely at the forefront of people's minds now, but I honestly try to think about who we might be as humans on this planet in 50 years' time looking back and saying, really, you mob had all this information about climate change and you did nothing about it? Really, sovereignty, you missed that one? How did you do it? And so I'm not only answerable and accountable here and now, I have to be answerable 8 generations ahead, and that's where my head is at. Yeah.
I'm just going to say Kerry's the opposite of John Howard because he doesn't look 8 generations ahead. He didn't even look 1 generation ahead. and thought he would be portrayed fairly by history. I think we'll all see he will be portrayed very poorly by history. But I like what Kerry said, and that's often how I think about things. How will people down the line look at us? And I think, unfortunately, Australia will be viewed in this era as a very, very backward nation, which is to my enduring shame. But I'm pleased to say, you know, I don't get it right all the time, but I'm not as backward as some others.
And George?
Look, I think Chris is right. We may well be looked at in that way, but we've actually got a chance to do something. You know, there's a possible ray of light here, however difficult it is. But I would say on the sovereignty question, which is a really important part of this debate, the constitutional change agenda doesn't cut across sovereignty. It just doesn't touch that debate. If nothing else, if Aboriginal people are going to assert their sovereignty as they should, it shouldn't be in the Constitution. It's something independent to them. It's their sovereignty. It's something that's articulated and exercised through doing, through actions. Aboriginal sovereignty does not and should not need the permission of the Australian Constitution. It's just an entirely separate concept. And that's why I would say to Aboriginal people, well, you can fight for this. You can fight for a constitution that finally treats you equally and doesn't enable discrimination against you, and at the same time exercise your sovereignty. It's just different, and don't see them as linked, because actually to see them as linked is to get into a problem. So that's why I personally feel very comfortable that there's a way through this that's consistent with maintaining that sovereignty.
And I think for me that's the ultimate in self-determination, is not having to ask anyone permission. You know, can I please do this? I think we've had a couple of generations of that and no more.
If you'll join me in thanking our three terrific speakers tonight, Kerry Arabena, George Williams and Chris Graham.